The 53-year-old County Derry priest, Father Edward Kilpatrick, has been cleared of all sexual abuse charges brought by two former altar boys. At a courthouse in Newry this afternoon, the jury of 6 men and 6 women unanimously found Father Kilpatrick not guilty of 19 charges.
Father Edward Kilpatrick plays a game of 25 with a group of parishioners every Monday night. It's a pleasure that he rediscovered during his long enforced exile from his parish in Murlog, outside Lifford, County Donegal.
Hello. The first time I heard of the allegations was when the then administrator of the diocese, Bishop Francis Lagan, phoned me here to this house and asked me to call and see him. Now, I had no idea what he wanted, but I wasn't too surprised that he was calling for me, because at that stage I was quite involved in a number of diocesan commissions, and I thought it was about some work that I was doing. So I went off to the bishop's house, and he told me briefly that a number of allegations had been made against me concerning the sexual abuse of a young boy some 20 years previously, whom I had known in a previous parish.
What had your relationship with this boy been like?
He was a parishioner in a former parish. He eventually expressed an interest in the priesthood. I was instrumental in encouraging him and in helping him, and he went off to the seminary, and I had contact with him in the seminary, like any priest in any parish, encouraging vocation. The conversation between the bishop and myself was brief, and I left and came back here to the house. I drove back in a state of complete numbness. I don't even remember actually driving back, and returned to the house here. And the only person in the house was my housekeeper, and having been my housekeeper for a number of years, she knew immediately that there was some problem.
EVELYN Collins has worked for Father Kilpatrick for 16 years. She was his housekeeper while he served in Steelstown, near Derry. That was the parish where the alleged abuse was said to have taken place.
He told me somebody had made an allegation against him, and I was just dumbfounded. I couldn't believe. And like, he was really in a state of shock.
When the weekend I was told about the allegations, when I had time then to settle and to take the whole thing in, I knew then that these allegations were false and I had nothing to answer. I did sit down and look back at, you were talking about 20 years ago. I did sit down and I looked at my life. And I said to myself, my goodness, there's nothing, this is all a complete fantasy, complete fabrication. And I made up my mind then, this thing would have to be fought totally.
In October '94, a new bishop was consecrated in Derry, Bishop Seamus Hegarty. Father Kilpatrick went to see him to discuss the allegations. Then in the new year, the bishop asked to see him again.
He asked me, would I be prepared to accept a psychiatric assessment? I said I had no problems with that, but I first asked that he would acquaint me in writing with the details of the allegations. Sometime later, that document containing the written allegations was presented to me, and I was quite happy to accept a psychiatric assessment, and that was a copy sent to me, a copy sent to the bishop, and that brought us into the spring of '95.
What did that psychiatric assessment say about you?
That psychiatric assessment portrayed me as a normal, heterosexual individual. There were no problems with it whatsoever. It was a great boost for my confidence. I think that was the important thing, because in the middle of all that trauma and pressure, you know, I remember my solicitor telling me this, you know, never to start doubting myself, to be confident, and that psychiatric assessment gave me great confidence. At the beginning of October, I had another phone call, this time from Bishop Hegarty, asking would I come and see him. And he told me that if I wished, I could bring a friend with me. Now, the phone call sounded ominous, and I knew there was something very serious. So I contacted my solicitor immediately. He agreed with me that this sounded serious. So I went off to see the bishop with a friend of mine, who then informed me that a second person had come forward with allegations. At this stage, I was in a state of absolute shock. I didn't know how to react. I simply couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. The second individual who made the allegations, I couldn't recollect him. I had no recollection of him at all. And to the bishop, I denied the allegations totally and absolutely. And then things began to move very quickly. The bishop at that stage indicated that I would have to leave the parish, and have to leave the parish immediately. Well, if the allegations were a shock, the thought of leaving the parish was simply the end of the world. Well, Maggie, are you up here now, Mary? When did you move up?
Today just started.
You leave Lifford today, just?
Yes.
Left Lifford. We're far better up here. Oh, far better. Bishop was insistent that I would leave the parish. So I had to think, what was I going to do? You know, I was innocent, and I was going to proclaim my innocence, and I was going to fight these allegations. So I made up my mind fairly quickly over the weekend, and fairly definitely, that I was simply not going to walk out the front door of this house and close it behind me and disappear into the great big wilderness. I was not going to do that. So I decided that if I was going to leave this parish, I would do it openly, telling my parishioners the story, and also telling Irish society in general. So I contacted local media people, the local radio stations, the local press, and I invited them along to a mass in the church. I knew all during the mass that I was making this statement, and the nearer it came, the more nervous I became and the more bewildered I became. It was a very, very sad morning, you know, and it just was the end of something, and it was just unbelievably sad and traumatic, the whole thing.
Father Kilpatrick categorically denies the unspecified allegations, which relate to a time he spent in Derry in the 70s. And while not directly critical of Bishop Hegarty of Derry, who he says told him he would have to leave Murlog, he said he didn't think any of the clergy were happy with the policy of the Episcopal Conference in cases like this.
It was very difficult at the beginning, facing the people, you know, going out. Especially, I remember the first Saturday night went out to church, and you felt that, you know, all eyes were on you walking up the chapel. It was difficult at home for my parents, who really idolised a son, a priest, as we all did and still do. It was difficult for them because my father, a very quiet man, didn't say a lot about it. My mother would have talked a bit about it, especially to my sister and myself. But at times you go in maybe and you'd see her sitting, maybe a few tears, and she'll get over that again and chat about it.
When I had been talking to the bishop about leaving this parish, the whole thing had happened so suddenly that there was nowhere for me to go. And the auxiliary bishop at that stage had been making inquiries about the possibility of somewhere for me to live. But there simply was nowhere. We had got nowhere. So when I actually left that front door of this house, I walked onto the street out there. I literally had nowhere to go. I wasn't going home. My parents were elderly. I wasn't going to inflict myself on them with all that was about to happen. I had simply nowhere to go. I had made contact with a friend of my housekeeper's who had a brother living in London who owned a house in an area adjacent to a parish where I had worked for 10 years. So I made contact with this man in London and discovered that he was willing to rent me the house. My housekeeper came with me and decided that she would stay with me. So we were both paid by the diocese during the period that I was not working in the parish. She was paid her normal salary. And she looked after the house and looked after me, but she hadn't much to do.
What was it like during the time when you were up in Glen Ely, in the wilderness really?
Yeah, it was very lonely and strange because like you were at a loose end and like you just didn't know what was happening, and like we had a lot of laity calling and a few priests, but like it was a very, very tough time.
How did you manage?
Well, I would be very involved in sport, so my sport kept me going, and my family and my boyfriend were a great rock for me to keep my spirits up.
There were no protests, there were no abusive phone calls. Nobody said, you shouldn't be living here, you're a danger to our children. Nothing like that. I was accepted. That was vitally important for my sanity. As soon as I stepped down from the parish, the bishop slapped a suspension order on me. So I was no longer able to, in any way, officiate or participate in public ceremonies. That was probably the single biggest difficulty that I had to face following the allegations. So I had nowhere to say Mass. There were lots of letters, lots of support, and lots of letters of good wishes and prayers. And those were very important. Those prayers were very important. I think I was angry with everybody. I was angry with God because I had worked for over 20 years as a priest, and you know, I'm not saying I was the best priest in the world, but at the same time I don't think I was all that ineffective. So I was angry with him for you know, allowing the situation to develop. I was angry with the church. I was angry with the people making the allegations. I was just angry in general. And you know, it didn't matter who, I was just angry, full stop.
Were you supported by the official church?
The official church, I suppose, distanced itself from me. While it didn't overtly condemn me, at the same time, it did develop a distance. I think that's what happened.
Father Edward Kilpatrick went voluntarily to the RUC station at Strand Road early this morning. There he was formally arrested. At the same time, at the courthouse in Derry, a few parishioners from County Donegal gathered, among them Senator Paddy McGowan. It was a gesture of support. They were joined by a number of priests.
I appeared first at Derry Magistrates Court in the middle of January. Was remanded there until Derry Magistrates in the middle of February, and then was remanded to the Crown Court in May of 1996. From May of '96 began an horrendous year for me, because the court case became complicated. It got bogged down in so many things. There were so many messes by the Crown. It was just a living nightmare from now on. My legal team were obliged to make a number of applications for abuse of process, as a legal term. Now, these applications were not of my doing or of my making.
Eventually, after all these delays, the case was transferred out of the Derry jurisdiction altogether.
So the trial got going. It was scheduled for Newry in the Armagh judicial area for February the 12th, 1997, which was Ash Wednesday, which was probably the loneliest day of my life. That morning, I awoke in Newry and I went out for a walk, because down a small road I had spotted a church. So I headed out that morning to the church on my own, thinking that it would be at least open, or maybe I might be lucky enough to come across a morning mass, because it was Ash Wednesday. And I arrived at the church and the church was locked. That almost symbolised my isolation and my being closed out.
Father Edward Kilpatrick took the stand for the first time at Armagh Crown Court today. He faces 19 charges of gross indecency and indecent assault against two young altar boys, dating back to 1975, when he was a curate in Steelstown Parish in Londonderry. As his lawyer put a series of the allegations to him, he denied each one in turn.
It was totally humiliating. To have to stand in the dock of any courthouse is an experience that I wouldn't recommend to anybody. To have to stand there and listen to a list of allegations about yourself, alleging sexual misconduct, is humiliation in its worst possible form. And I found that very difficult to cope with, to simply sit and listen to these things being said about me.
Did you look at your accusers?
Oh, I did. I certainly did. When I went into court, I saw them, and I had no hesitation about expressing certainly an outer confidence. And while they were in the witness box giving their evidence, I looked at them and I took notes of what they were saying. And, you know, after each session, my legal team and myself compared our notes, and I followed the trial minutely and in every detail. And the judge was concerned that I would do that.
The priest said he denied the charges with all the strength he could muster, and he said allegations that he had abused one of the boys in the bathroom of St Eugene's Cathedral in Derry were absolutely ludicrous, and further claims that offences took place in the bogland near Balachi he called sheer fantasy.
Did you come to understand at any stage why the allegations were brought?
I thought about that a lot, naturally, during all those years. And I suppose it was a very vulnerable time for the church. I suppose it was the most vulnerable experience for the church in my times. So the church was very vulnerable, very open. There was a mood of hysteria about the place. The church had handled the early cases badly. The bishops at that stage, naturally enough, were out to protect the institution. So with that background and atmosphere, it wasn't too difficult for somebody to come along and make an allegation.
Father Kilpatrick denied a suggestion from the prosecution that his affair with the older of the two boys broke up because he had been having an affair with his housekeeper, EVELYN Collins. The case continues. Sharon Hall, UTV Live at Armagh Crown Court.
People made allegations about Father Eddie and myself supposed to be having an affair, and then they put out that I was supposed to have a child and that Father Eddie was the father of it. It really hurt because there was no truth whatsoever, but like people believed it, and even went as far as when we were living in Glenealy. Like I played a lot of soccer and I played for a team in Northern Ireland, and I had the football jerseys in the line. The football jerseys were white, and one lady went as far as saying that she knew it was true that I had a baby because she saw the nappies on the line. The nappies were in fact football jerseys, so it was very tough.
EVELYN had been with me for a long number of years, and during the days in the wilderness and during the trial, she was with me all the time. She never wavered or left me, and went through an awful time herself. She paid a heavy personal price. She was a totally innocent person, living an independent life from me, working for me, and yet her life was caught up in this web of intrigue and conspiracy and deceit and lies.
Finally, on May the 8th, 1997, came the verdict of the jury.
And then the clerk read out the first charge and asked, "What is your verdict?" Not guilty. And I remember there was a gasp went round the courtroom that day, an audible gasp. And then the whole thing settled down again to the tension. And each charge was read out, all 19 charges were read out. And that foreman stood up each time and said, "Not guilty." And it was a unanimous not guilty, not a majority verdict, not a 10-2 or whatever it is, unanimous verdict. And on the 19th charge, not guilty, the court erupted, and the judge just asked for a moment of calm, and he just looked down at me and he said, "You and I have been part of each other's lives for quite some time, and even though we had never spoken to one another, yet there was a strange relationship between the two of us." And he adverted to that you know, I appeared before him on what, 23 different occasions. He said we've been part of one another's lives for quite some time. He expressed concern at the strain and the tension that I was under. He did. And he said he appreciated that. But he said also, which is very interesting, he said there may have been occasions when perhaps this trial could have ended. But he said this trial had to go the full way because you were a priest in the public domain. And he said if these allegations had not been faced fully, and if a verdict of not guilty had not been given, he said questions would have hung over you for the rest of your life. He said you have been judged, you know, not guilty by your peers, and you're now free to go. That was it.
The end of a 3-year nightmare. That's how Father Edward Kilpatrick described his feelings after the jury unanimously found him not guilty on all 19 sex abuse charges.
I have no particular feelings towards them. They're not part of my life. They're in the past. They have their problems and they have their difficulties. And insofar as they have those problems and difficulties, I would have a certain sympathy for them. But They're of the past, they're in the past. I have no particular feelings or thoughts about them whatsoever. Good strong lemonade, that. Good strong lemonade, that.
Good strong. What do you know?
You have to go on a diet, right? You have to go on a diet for the new year.
That's right.
You stay here for Christmas?
I was with my brother.
Should be touring the world. Top concert halls. Top of the pops.
I can sing it. What about Margaret McNamee? Margaret, will you sing me song? That's our parish priest.
On imprint